From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today we're going to continue to tell the story of one of the key players of the period, and that's Governor Tom Judge. You know, in earlier segments we've talked about his early years, his formative years, and then we had a segment, an episode about the 1972 campaign and the first administration of the governor. We're going to follow with a segment on his second administration, because he had 8 years as governor right in the heart of the period of In the Crucible of Change. Today, however, we're going to focus on politics and challenges. We call this Comeback Kid because we're going to talk about Tom Judge in the latter stages of his first administration and some of the challenges politically that were brought forth, and made it even look a little bit dicey about whether or not he would get a second term. And then we'll work our way through the election itself, which resulted in essentially a record win at that time. So it's a terrific story of comeback, and we're lucky to have a couple special guests who participated actively in both the ending of the first administration and in the campaign of 1976. First is Kent Kleinkopf. Kent has joined us again, and we've introduced him before to you, but Kent has got his degree, his bachelor's from University of Idaho, his master's in economics from the University of Utah. Went to work for Ted Schwinden when he was the land commissioner, but quickly slid over and went to work for Tom Judge in his first campaign. You were probably his first full-time staffer in that campaign, unpaid, however, and you became part of his first administration, where you were the first citizen advocate of the state of Montana, a position that still helps citizens deal with government. You stayed in the Judge administration through the 1972 campaign, the Citizens Advocate years, the 76 campaign. You were then named the director of what was then called Business.
The Department of Business Regulation.
Business Regulation. Now it's the Department of Commerce, but you were director of that department. And after doing that for a few years, you went into the private sector, where for the last 28 years you've been in the vocational rehabilitation consultation field, although I understand you retired recently.
We have. We're in the process of finally closing down our office.
Well, congratulations on that. You've got time to hang a few signs.
Kathy, my wife and I are pretty happy to be where we are right now.
In Missoula now for many, many years.
Right.
Joined by Bruce Nelson. Bruce is a Fort Benton native, went to the University of Montana, and although he lives in Bozeman here quite a bit in recent years, he remains a big Grizzly fan.
That's right.
Bruce was a student lobbyist for the students at the University of Montana when doing that and some work in and around the McGovern campaign when we first were acquainted. When Bruce first came into government and politics at a higher level, it was to come into the administration of Governor Tom Judge to work with me, in full disclosure. And part of our role was to try to help the governor establish a strong position with the people of Montana, which, and as you often say, good government is good politics. So we were trying to get good government to work and be seen by the people of Montana. So you were in the governor's office with me, but left in 1976 when we had our first presidential primary in a lot of years. You managed the Frank Church for President campaign in Montana, which was a big, successful campaign, a real hallmark. It was a wonderful campaign you ran. And then you went back in to help with the campaign and into the governor's office. And you stayed there for several years when you left to help with the Pat Williams campaign. And again, we worked together on the Pat Williams campaign. And when Pat was elected to Congress, you went back to Washington, D.C., and you were his chief of staff for a number of years, but couldn't resist coming back to Montana, right? The farm was calling, and Fort Benton you were missing Fort Benton. But after you'd been on the farm for a little while, you became and were elected state Democratic Party chairman, at which time you served almost 8 years, is that, weren't you?
Yep, and, 83 through almost the end of 91.
And it was during that period that you and I worked together again, because I was elected national committee man of the party. So we continued this ongoing relationship for some period of time. But when Bill Clinton was elected, you were selected by the president to be the head of the Farm Service Agency in Montana, and did that for the full 8 years, essentially, of the Clinton administration.
Yep.
You left that into the private sector again, but worked with Brian Schweitzer, and after his election in 2004, you went into the governor's office, where again you were chief of staff, and I was lucky enough to be able to work with you in that. I was there for the full 8 years, but after about 5 years, you were asked by President Obama, once he was elected, to become head of Farm Service Agency again. Is that right?
Yep.
So you've been doing that for his administration, including a year of service in D.C.?
Yep. Well, I got recycled into the state executive director position in 2009, then was asked to go back to Washington, D.C. to head up the Farm Service Agency for 14 months, at which time I promoted myself back into the state executive director position in Montana, and was very happy to come home from Washington, D.C. for the second time.
So you could get back to Montana.
That's right.
That's always the case. I notice you're wearing an interesting lanyard there, and that's, I think, a leftover of the Schweitzer years, isn't it?
Yeah, this was something that those of us who worked in Indian affairs in the Schweitzer administration were presented with at the end of the first administration by Anna Whiting Sorrell, and Jennifer Perez Cole and Rhonda Whiting for our service working on Indian issues in the first term.
And that was one of the hallmarks of that administration was opening the doors of
pretty
government.
special. Now it holds my federal identification card. And
well, welcome to both of you, because you both played significant roles over an extended period of time in both the public administration of Governor Judge and with his campaigns. And again, saying that there was an integration of politics and policy is something we all need to recognize is, again, like you say, good policy, good government is good politics. And so you all both contributed to that. Now the race we're talking about, which was the 1976 race, you may recall that we talked about how, in previous segment, about how Tom had a pretty massive win over Big Ed Smith in 1972. In 1976, he ended up running against Bob Woodall. Bob Woodall had been more than just a state senator. He'd been Attorney General for 8 years. And as Attorney General, he'd had his eye on the governorship for a significant period of time. I like to refer to him as kind of the accidental Attorney General in a way, because he was a relative unknown county attorney out of Teton County, Choteau, And he was running in the general election in 1968 against Gene Daly, who was the county attorney of Cascade County, one of the biggest cities and counties in the state, who looked like he was going to win, far and away was going to win, big time. But it's worth repeating the story about things happen in politics sometimes, because a Great Falls Tribune reporter, John Kuglin, had written a series of articles about prostitution and bribery and lots of things that were going on, nefarious things that were going on in Butte Silver Bow. Gambling, yeah, that were going on in Butte Silver Bow. And the Lee newspapers, according to Chuck Johnson, decided since there was a story written about Butte and nobody had written the story about Great Falls, they sent a couple of reporters, a couple of writers and researchers up to Great Falls, Sam Reynolds and Jerry Madden, and who then did a big expose in the Lee papers about prostitution and gambling and kind of nefarious deeds that were going on in Great Falls. And lo and behold, that ran 2 weeks before the election in 1968. And it was enough of a problem there, enough of an appearance of difficulty, that Bob Woodall suddenly won by only 9,000 votes over Daley, and then he was Attorney General. And again, he immediately had his eyes on the governorship, but he was called Bingo Bob. Does anybody want to talk a little bit about what that was about?
Well, as I remember, Mr. Woodall had been around the state shutting down little old ladies' bingo parlors.
He really hated gambling.
He hated gambling, and he thought bingo was, the way it was being conducted was illegal. So he would shut these games down. Needless to say, that didn't endear himself to many, many people around the state at that time.
Well, you know, that was the nickname, was Bingo Bob Woodall, and it stuck with him. But that being said, when you're an incumbent state office holder, when you're elected at the state level and you're holding office and you have responsibilities, as he did, as the head of the, ultimately as the head of the law enforcement, the highway patrol and everything, you know, that incumbency is worth something. So in 1972, he ran against Skeff Sheehy.
Skeff Sheehy, yeah.
Skeff was a state senator from Billings and well known, but
big family, well known, a lot of friends around the state, but you know, in spite of what was a pretty good year for Democrats and Tom Judge being elected governor, succeeding Forrest Anderson and keeping the governorship in the hands of the Democratic Party, Bob Woodall won by a big margin against Skeff, and pretty much set himself up for a potential race in 4 years.
And it does go to show you that the value of having been on the ballot and being a statewide officer as opposed to being a legislator who sits over here elected out of just either one county at that time, and now it's just out of one district. So a lot of times legislators are, when they get in the legislative process, think, boy, this is the most important thing in the world, and everybody in the world and everybody in Montana knows me.
Everybody knows me.
Everybody knows me.
Yeah.
But the truth is, it doesn't hold a candle to.
And then the first time when they get on the campaign trail that they go over to the neighboring community and find out nobody knows who they are,
Right.
it's kind of a surprise to them.
Yep.
So that even happened to Skeff, who was a wonderful gentleman, and later a rather significant, and he still is, he's still around, and he was a rather significant member of the Montana Supreme Court for many years. So a straight House member, state senator, Supreme Court, but Woodall defeated him. In fact, I think the race against Skeff, it was about a 9 percentage point win, which is a fairly good win. I mean, it was about a 30,000 vote win. Wasn't huge, but it was, you know, it was a Democratic year, and yet Woodall won. So all of a sudden, he's still there, and he's kind of pecking away at wanting to be, and he wants to be governor. There's no question about that. So that sets the kind of political context of why Woodall was there. Now, he by the way, was opposed in the Republican primary in 1976. Jack McDonald wanted to be governor too. Jack was an interesting story. It's worth us reflecting on. He was a former Democratic state senator.
Yeah, he was a Democratic state senator from Belt, very highly thought of rancher from community out there, and had in fact been the majority whip in the state Senate.
One of the big proponents of the new Constitution, Constitutional
session.
Convention. Yeah, he was one of the big proponents of the Constitutional Convention. He was a leader in the leadership of the Democrats.
Switched parties.
He switched parties. He
And
kind of got a little
ran in,
conservative as he got older, I take it, or something.
Yeah.
That
hasn't happened to any of us, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, Robert Frost one time said that I was afraid to be liberal when young for fear of becoming conservative when old. I find myself getting more liberal. I don't know, but in any case, we had a situation here where McDonald ran against Woodall in the primary, but before that primary, a lot of stuff happened late in the last half of the first administration of Governor Judge. I think we all discussed in earlier segments about the great policy things that were being done on education funding and institution. Give us a 1 minute on the significant accomplishments that were going on with that administration. Economic development, executive reorganization, so on.
Well, going back to the 72 campaign, Evan, I campaigned with Tom Judge virtually daily. I drove the car, made arrangements for meetings, that sort of thing, advance work. We campaigned very hard for the Constitution at that time. Every place we went, that was one of the primary things that we talked about. So
then you got to help implement it.
And then we got to help implement it, the best part.
Yeah.
The things that we were looking forward to, however, were environmental protection,
Right.
Adequate educational funding, doing something about the horrible situation in our state's institutions at the time.
Executive reorganization being implemented.
And beginning the implementation of executive reorganization. So those were some pretty monumental achievements.
Well, in fact, I think when you look at the history books right up Tom Judge, the accomplishments are phenomenal. You know, partially a product of the time, partially there they were, but he was for the right stuff and got it done. Pretty significant record of accomplishment.
Which you might add has pretty systematically been unraveled.
Well, at least
then.
there have been attempts, and some has been successful and some have not. But yeah, that's part of the challenge. That's why we're in this period of progressive change we're talking about. Tom Judge was such an important figure. Now, as we approach the second half of the administration, it kind of started in the first half that his election had happened, but the context that was going on then was the Watergate context nationally. There was this exposure of this nefarious stuff that went on with Richard Nixon in Watergate, and everyone was looking at campaign laws and where the money flowed and this and that, and we had a campaign finance law that was adopted in 1912 by initiative called the Corrupt Practices Act. It was a good law for 1912, but it wasn't very thorough. So the 1972 Judge campaign had been conducted under a 1912 law, but was being looked at in a post-1972 perspective, and was found, like any campaign, to be pretty inadequate in terms of the level of reporting and how accurate it was, because there weren't even any forms to report on. That led to a lot of suspicion, and
Wasn't even clear who you were to report to.
yeah.
Sloppy bookkeeping is the term that is most often used in that regard.
But out of that came two things kind of converged, which was kind of I don't want to use the word revelation, but it became clear that almost 100,000, I think the term was $94,000, had not been accurately reported, although it had been mostly spent in the campaign. A little bit was left over. It hadn't been accurately reported. And that became a cause célèbre because we were looking at it through post-Watergate eyeglasses.
Yeah, and that together with issues out of investigation by Attorney General Woodall of the Workers' Comp Division. That
and there was
set the stage in a pretty difficult political environment for a second run for governor Judge.
Yeah, it was pretty tough, and what happened was that there was enough. Actually, I think in fairness, I think it's worth saying that for some reason Tom had not engendered a great deal of loyalty personally from legislators, because he was very aggressive about getting stuff done. And so within the legislature and within some of the party apparatus, Democratic Party apparatus, there were people out there that were stirring it up and saying we should be, because of this reporting discrepancy, which, by the way, never turned out to be anything illegal, but it was politically awkward. There were discussions of censuring the governor and asking the governor to resign, impeaching the governor. These were all words that were floating around. It made a very difficult political environment.
Well, and when you look back at it, especially after the 1972 and 74 elections, there were very strong majorities of Democrats in the state legislature. And there was a feeling in the legislature at that time, because I was an intern in the legislature in 1973 and student lobbyist in 75, so I was kind of watching it from a little bit of an independent perspective, that the Judge administration could have been and should have been more in the forefront of things like the enactment of the Major Facility Siting Act and the coal severance tax. And when in fact the administration, governor, judge were not only supportive of it, but a lot of that legislation, including more than adequate funding of the school foundation program, because I think they had the biggest increase in the school foundation schedules, those sessions since 1948, when the foundation program was established. The governor wasn't given credit for not only having supported that and signed the legislation, but that a lot of it came out of his administration.
Actually proposed a lot of these initiatives.
So if you were honest about it, a lot of that actually came out of Tom Judge and his administration.
Right.
That being said, being judged by post-Watergate values, when you were pre-Watergate with the problems, we understood inside the governor's office. When I left the party and went into the governor's office in 1974, back into the governor's office in 74, Governor Judge said, let's fix this campaign mess up. And we proposed a law and had a big committee work on it for an extended period of time, proposed a campaign finance law, which still is the law today, and which has the strongest campaign enforcement mechanisms of any state administration of campaigns in the United States, and it still does. And if anybody likes the enforcement, the tough enforcement that's being done right now by the commissioner today, for example, they can thank Tom Judge, because he pushed the legislation, got it through the legislature, and signed it. You and I were there for the signing. You were helpful.
Yep, I had the honor and privilege to be there when the governor signed it, and having supported it on behalf of the Montana Student Lobby, because the students of the university system understood the importance of a strong campaign finance law in Montana, so that the state that they would be a part of when we all got out of college was one that we could be proud of and know that the politics were above board in.
Now that was done in the 75 session. An extremely difficult time because 1974 got really rugged for Governor Judge. And it got very rugged because of a thing known as the workers' compensation scandal. And we don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this thing. But briefly, there were some evidence that some of the money that was flowing into the campaign in 1972 came from attorneys who was related to workers' compensation, and there was a question of quid pro quo on that. And of course, the Attorney General jumped all over that. That was an opportunity. He deeply believed in conspiracy. He hated gambling. He was a purist. He really believed there was a conspiracy around every corner. And so consequently, he jumped all over this thing and pushed on it really hard. And in the 74 session, he got the legislature, even though it was Democratic, to appropriate $980,000 to him to do an investigation of it. That's almost $1 million.
In 1974.
In 74 dollars.
A lot of money.
A lot of money to start poking around in everything. And he did, even got through the Supreme Court ruling, a grand jury impaneled, and all kinds of people were called in. And there was in fact, there was a lot of contextual things where the kind of things that were going on in Montana with investigation and with wiretapping and with pursuing legal action against people and questioning them and bringing them in was very similar to some of the secretive stuff that was going on with Nixon and his enemies list.
Correct.
In fact, Tom Judge was audited 3 or 4 consecutive years in terms of the IRS, which audited 18 Democratic governors and no Republican governors.
At the same time.
So there was kind of stuff going on, but Woodall had $1 million.
There was a climate of absolute fear in a lot of areas in the nation, and including in Montana.
And one thing that did happen was there was a person that was found guilty, and which was Jim Carden was found guilty of some violations, and he was the head of the workers' comp division, and he did a humongous deposition, which was very revealing and looked really bad, even though there weren't there were no illegalities on the part of the governor. But it was kind of drug into it, and suddenly that affidavit was published in every daily paper in the state of Montana in December of '74. And so at that time, I think it would be fair to say that people looked at Tom Judge and said, this is a guy who can't win. I mean, is that how you guys saw it?
Well,
or that you never say die, but look tough.
There was a great deal of concern, absolutely.
When I came to work up in the governor's office in the fall of 1975, I think the handicappers, the political handicappers in the state, would have maybe at best given the governor even odds of re-election the following year. So, but and I think at that point. It was kind of a crossroads for the governor and his administration and those of us who were part of it. And I think part of it was that he had to decide at that point whether he was going to continue to kind of be a captive of Helena and this kind of bad political environment that had been created here by the workers' comp issues, by the campaign finance issues, or if he was going to break free of that. And breaking free involved going out and being governor of the rest of the state. Because every governor is faced with that. There's people in Helena that think that the governor is a Helena person and ought to just govern Helena. Well, good governors that do it right know they need to be governor of the whole state. And so I remember you telling me that, Evan, when I first came to work. And so we spent a lot of time, Kent, you were involved with that, getting the governor out of Helena, back out on the road, not only talking about what he had actually done and his part in it,
Or not done.
But listening to what was on the minds of people out there and not just here in Helena.
Well, Evan, we all knew, of course, inside the administration that we hadn't done anything wrong.
Right.
So we had a strong feeling that we were being maligned. The climate of fear had gripped a lot of people, and including the media, and so there were some very dark days at that time that we had to work out of.
But it was a lot darker in Helena than it was if you were in Shelby or if you were in Sydney, because out there, although they were getting a whiff of it, the way it is in a capital city, whether it be Washington D.C. or Helena, Montana, is all that stuff becomes pervasive.
Yeah.
Because out there, the kids in the public schools were getting a better education because of the funding that the Judge administration and the Democratic legislators and responsible Republicans had done in those legislative sessions.
And if they had someone in an institution from that community,
they were getting better
treated
care.
Better.
The folks down in the coal development area could now count on coal severance tax and a strong reclamation law and a major facility siting act. So it was a matter of, again, the governor getting out of Helena, of being governor of the rest of the state, of letting him know what he'd done in addition to what he hadn't done, together with the legislators, Democrats and Republicans alike.
And that was effective.
Mm-hmm. Now, and so in the governor's office, one of the primary things we were doing when you came on board, and you were immensely valuable in getting that done, was to get him scheduled around the state and get him out there. Make sure he had the opportunity to do governmental relations work with his own constituents, know what they cared about. Now, eventually, citizens forums went to all 56 counties before he was done, right?
Went to all 56 counties. Kent, you were with him on most of those? Most of those? All 7 reservations, not just once, but several times, and for the first time, as near as we could tell for any governor, to all of the university campuses
right.
with an open mic. And that's a risky thing to do on a university campus, to just open up the mic, but Tom Judge went out and was willing to do that and did it.
And he had a really good sense of what people wanted. Of course, it didn't hurt that the economy was strong. And while he was doing this visitation around, he came up with the idea of a homestead tax relief, which wasn't passed by the legislature. Governor Judge proposed it, and his minions, if you will, people like us, worked with the folks out there in the state and helped get the signatures to put it on the ballot. Which overwhelmingly gave a check back to people who on their property taxes, because we were in good shape financially as a state.
And it gave the same amount to the retired, homeowner in Great Falls whose home might be worth $10,000 or $12,000 as it did to the very well-to-do person in the Billings suburb whose home at that time may have been worth $100,000. So it was fair to everybody.
So out of all this thing, he started the part of the Comeback Kid story was letting him be out there and be himself with his constituents. Now, because he was so aggressive about it, he was unopposed in the primary. And but let me have you guys share for a minute with me your sense of him as a campaigner, because we've heard Ted Schwinden talk about how unbelievably strong he was as a campaigner and energetic.
Well, I can personally attest to that, having traveled with him on a daily basis for 9 months in the '72 campaign. 16-hour days, plant gates at 5 o'clock in the morning every morning. till midnight, often with supporters, finally, after having campaigned bowling alleys, supermarkets, street corners. He was tireless. He probably was, I would say, the most effective campaigner that the state has seen. He certainly was the most energetic.
And to follow on that, when he would go into a restaurant, for example, he would not only greet all the customers, he would make sure that he met all the waiters and waitresses, and then he would go back in the kitchen and shake hands with the cooks and with the folks washing dishes. And I was, almost 20 years younger than Tom, in my 20s at the time. And at the end of the day, when we, leave that last plant shift, and you know this story, you know all this more than I did, because as much as I traveled with him, you traveled with him 10 times more. But at the end of the day, I was pooped. I was ready to go to bed. And Tom was upset because there weren't any more hands to shake or babies to kiss.
Well, Ted Schwinden, who was running that was the first cycle in which the lieutenant governor and the governor under the new Constitution ran together. Prior to that, they'd ran separately, and sometimes with some interesting results of different parties and so on. But Ted Schwinden was then running with Governor Judge, and he related how they were finishing up in Great Falls and the election was pretty much over, and said, we were so tired we just wanted to get in the car and go back to Helen and get in our bed and go to sleep. And Tom said, well, I'm going back down to the bowling alleys. It was the night before the election. Yeah. So that kind of energy, and nobody really could retail as good as Tom Judge, I mean, he was pretty amazing at it. He loved people, and it did make a difference. Let's talk a little bit about the Judge Schwinden thing, because the lieutenant governor for the first cycle was Bill Christensen. And Bill was a former legislator out of Hardin, former legislative leader of the Democrats, well-respected guy, was thinking about the possibility of running for election, although there were some people who were trying to romance him into running for governor. But
successful business person.
Very successful.
Yes.
Automobile dealer. He was a business Democrat.
Very well respected.
Very well respected. And ultimately, he decided not to run. And I think to Tom that was a big disappointment because of the respect he had for Bill. And he had to find someone to run for governor. And I think he relates in his, for lieutenant governor with him. And he relates in his book that he set, his draft book, he never got it published before he passed, that he thought of Ted Schwinden as someone was standing, and he also thought of Ron Richards, who's been a subject of one of our programs inside the administration, as having the kind of standing to be lieutenant governor, and that they had all jointly met together and decided that Ted ought to be running with it. Mm-hmm. And Ted was a heck of a good campaigner, and he provided some real balance, didn't he?
Well, if you think about it a minute, you've got the Irish Catholic candidate from western Montana, Tom Judge for governor, and the son of homesteaders from Tule Creek, Montana, out by Wolf Creek, with a agriculture
Wolf Point.
Wolf Point. Yeah. And that that's a great balance. Tom with his background in journalism and public relations, and Ted off the farm, and with the government experience that he got, not only in the legislature but as state lands commissioner. Yes, that when Governor Anderson had him come down to Helena to be part of his administration. Mm-hmm. So for Montana, you couldn't ask for a more balanced mm-hmm. ticket.
Very strong ticket. Yeah, very strong.
So here you had all of a sudden Tom Judge running with Ted Schwinden on a ticket, the Judge Schwinden ticket. Woodall was wanting to run and was ready to run, though he had apparently spent $1 million and had very little to show for it. A couple convictions, but a big grand jury with not much coming out of it. That isn't to say there weren't some problems there, and there were some people that pled guilty, and there was at least one or two actual trials, but it wasn't the big explosive thing that it seemed to have been. And
well, one of the things that hurt Woodall's chances a lot were a couple of things. His chief prosecutor in the work comp scandal found himself on the wrong end of the law when he attempted to have a Keno caller allow him to play
for higher stakes
an excessive number of tickets, which was illegal.
That became public.
That became public, and of course he had to be prosecuted by the county attorney, who happened to be a Democrat, Tom Dowling, at the time. So that pretty well sunk any chance Mr. DeZevi ever had to gain higher office. It didn't help Mr. Woodall either.
And Woodall picked Tony Roselle, a respected,
very highly thought of
lady,
Republican
woman,
state senator from
Billings,
Billings.
with the Billings connection,
Right.
to be his running mate.
Right.
And that was a pretty darn good ticket, but Jack McDonald ran against him, by the way, with a fellow named Doug Kelly, and I think actually Woodall got 58% of the vote in that primary. So that's a pretty substantial win. But if you're the elected official and you've already been Attorney General twice, 58% was not a overwhelming showing.
Not overwhelming.
Well, you would, looking at political campaigns and the handicappers, they would think that he needed to at least get to 60% to have the kind of victory that a longtime incumbent should have had in statewide office.
Mm-hmm.
That could have been a sign there of some weakness.
So we had a campaign engaged, and it got really serious after the June primary. The workers' comp stuff had gone behind it. Woodall was campaigning actively. Tony Roselle was campaigning actively. Judge and Schwinden were out there campaigning actively. You had the battle for the homestead tax relief going on at the same time. There was a lot of stuff happening at that time, but it was a fairly interesting race in a number of ways. And I guess I'm going to take a second and kind of relate. When I was looking at Tom's not quite finished book, he talked a bit about the garbage bags, and that was a bit of an extended story, but it turned out that Bingo Bob, as they called him, people were a little suspect already. Turned out his medical records ended up in the hands of a reporter for the Great Falls Tribune. And those medical records show that he was repeatedly going into the hospital, being taken in by ambulance over and over and over again. And so the reporter asked him, well, what was that about? And he told the reporter, well, I get these terrible migraine headaches, and when I go in there, they give me the shots of this stuff called Demerol, and it fixes the headache. And then he volunteered. And by the way, now they gave me pills. And if I feel a headache coming on, I take those pills. Well, Demerol is a highly addictive drug, and it's a very, very suspect drug, very effective as a painkiller. But saying you've got a whole bunch of Demerol pills that you can pop any time was not a good thing to do. And it was revealed, it started to really hurt him politically, but there was a kind of an accident that happened. As a result of that story, General Womack, who was a very funny guy, he was the adjutant general, he was a very funny guy. He decided, he called me up. I would become deputy campaign manager of the Judge Schwinden campaign at that time. And he called me up and he said, Barrett, you gotta get a letter to the editor that condemns the press for revealing that Woodall has all these drugs in his medicine cabinet because every junkie in the state is going to want to break into his house. And it's really funny, kind of funny. And so I wrote a note down that said junkie letter, and I wrote Demerol down. I misspelled it, and I set the note aside, and nobody ever did anything. I didn't do anything with it. But
well, because the story was already out there from the Attorney General
What's there to
Woodall
do?
himself.
Yeah, he said it, and so I just set the note aside. But eventually, several months later, I cleaned my desk off, and I had months of stuff, and I put it in a bag and emptied it out and put it outside. And we were about a block and a half from the Woodall headquarters on Last Chance Gulch. And that night, a couple of Woodall staffers who'd left Bert and Ernie's came kind of down the street, and they probably had more drinks than they should have. And they looked down there, and they saw this garbage bag in front of our headquarters, and they went over and they took it. And they took it over to their headquarters, and the next day they opened it up, and they went through it, and they found this note that said Demerol junkie letter, and Woodall went crazy. He thought, this really proves that Tom Judge stole my medical records. But there were also letters in there that were 4 or 5 months back, because I was just cleaning my desk off after a long period of time. And so he calls a press conference and announces that Tom Judge has stolen his medical records, and he was just his eyes were all buggy, and he was just excited as could be. He had the smoking pistol that showed that Tom Judge had done this because of this note that said junkie letter Demerol, and he held a big press conference, and it became a big thing, and we had to deal with it in the campaign. It was an interesting story that I remember Ron Richards, who was campaign manager, and myself going to meet with Ted Schwinden and say, well, how do we respond to this? And long story being short, Ted said, I think people relate more to their garbage being stolen than they do their medical records, because we weren't in the HIPAA age back then. Nobody even really knew what their medical records were, and no privacy laws on them. So we called a press conference, and Ron held the press conference. And we prepared 2 big bags of garbage with Judge Schwinden bumper stickers on them. And Ron sat there, and he announced that it was dangerous for Woodall's campaign staffers to come skulking across Last Chance Gulch in the dark of night. They could get hit with cars and stuff. That in order to preserve their safety, we were going to deliver our garbage to Woodall for the rest of the campaign. And of course, the press just ate that up. They ate it up, and of course, it did look like they'd. In fact, Ron said, "Look at there. There's letters in there that are 4 months old, and 3 months old, and 2 months old, and these guys have been systematically pilfering the garbage." And so the fuss, suddenly it became a story of Woodall's been stealing garbage, which pretty much sank the campaign. I mean, that was almost the end.
When Ron walked across the street and deposited the 2 bags of garbage on Woodall, John Kavanaugh, his campaign manager's desk.
With cameras running.
With the cameras from virtually every television station in Montana there.
Yeah, and so it's things
We're
like that.
going to save you the trouble of having to collect our garbage. We're going to bring it to you.
Here you go. We'll deliver. We'll deliver.
And but ultimately, those are kind of campaign shenanigans. They're the kind of things that attack the attention of the press. But the real campaign was about the hearts and minds of Montanans, was about accomplishment, was about tax breaks for homeowners, it was about good environmental laws, good education funding, good policy. And Tom Judge stood for all those things. And so it's easy to get involved in the anecdotes of campaigns and forget that the real substance people look at is, how is the economy doing?
Yeah.
That type of thing.
They were pretty good times in Montana, and they were made better by Tom Judge, by Democrats and Republicans working together in the legislature and passing the most progressive legislation, not only in Montana history, but to this day, some of the most progressive legislation of any state in America. Because I've had the privilege of working for elected officials in the state since then, including Governor Schweitzer, and that foundation that was laid in that era was what we built upon in the Schweitzer administration and what Governor Bullock continues to build on today.
Good point. Well, you're fond of saying that good government makes good politics. What I am perhaps most proud of and feel privileged to have had the opportunity in the administrations that I served in were the people. The people that we brought into government, that we promoted, that we enticed to work perhaps for less than they could have in the private sector, were some of the best people that have ever served in state government. And Tom's book points that out rather clearly.
Repeatedly, he talks
and
about
repeatedly.
quality, yeah.
Yeah, well, it was sure an honor for me just having got out of the University of Montana to have been able to be a part of that. And to work not only with you, but for both of you in those days.
Did you think of any things in that campaign that stood out that you might want to relate? We all know about the retail politics. They're talking about
Well, I ran out of gas in the car twice. The first time, I pulled off onto a frontage road. I had to jump the barbed wire, cross both lanes of the interstate, go knock on the door of a defunct logging operation. He got out of bed, cranked up his old gas pump, and gave me a gallon of gas, and I threw $5 at him and ran back across the freeway and put it in the car, and we got to Missoula just a little bit late for the speech.
yeah.
The second time, when I ran out of gas, it was very early in the morning. As luck would have it, I pulled into the farmer's driveway, pulled right up to his gas pump, ran up, got him out of bed. He said, "Sure, I'll give you some gas." So did the same thing then. Threw $5 at him and took off. And we made it to Kalispell on time.
You know, it was an interesting operation, running in the campaign management side. Ron Richards, who clearly was a very serious player, had been party executive for the Democratic Party, had been an intern with Senator Metcalf, became chief of staff under Forrest Anderson, stayed as chief of staff. They didn't call it, they called it executive assistant back then. Chief of staff under Anderson, chief of staff under Judge, had headed up the highway department later, had a very sterling record over many, many years, was highly respected. Tom got him to run the campaign. And I ended up being the deputy, and sitting right next to me was Ted Schwinden's son, Mike. And Mike was helping out with the campaign. And that's about the heavy-duty structure with that. It wasn't like campaigns are today. Most of the advertising was done by Bob Henkel of Sage Advertising. Charlie Lester. They were the two guys that were doing the creative side of the advertising. Right. Tom was an advertising guy of his own, so he had a good sense of that. So you had a kind of a core team that was pretty fun to work with. Most of it was out in the field. The secret of good campaigns are that they aren't in Helena. They're out there in the field where you've got troops working and everything else. I'll relate one quick anecdote. Every candidate is susceptible to the ups and downs of campaigns, and Tom was no different. And he would go out, and if he didn't see enough signs, he would think, God, things are bad in this campaign. There aren't enough signs. And I saw Woodall signs, but I didn't see my own signs. So this got to be actually a bit of a problem. And we had a fellow that kept saying, what can I do to help the campaign? So we hired him and said, here's where the governor's going. And you stay, here's his schedule. And you take a car and go out there, and it's filled up with the signs, and you hang signs a day ahead of him. So everywhere the governor went, he saw signs of himself. And it did amazing things for the esprit de corps of the campaign. He thought, oh, this campaign is so good because funny how
Signs
something
everywhere.
like that makes a difference psychologically in a campaign. But again, the big thing was we had a strong economy, a dynamite economy at the time.
Well, and there was consistency between what was happening in the governor's office, in governing,
Right.
and what was happening in the campaign. The messages were the same. People in the campaign, like you and Ron, had been part of the administration. And so it was a matter simply of the campaign getting the governing process out to people and the benefits of it.
In fact, it's sometimes commonplace for the campaign to be so separate from the administration that they lose their synchronicity.
Right.
You know, we're getting close to the end.
Once again, Evan, great people.
Yeah.
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 Can't
Well,
say
we're
enough.
we're getting close to the end. Not there yet, but I want to ask if you have a personal reflection on your activities that you might want to. What it meant to you to be part of both the campaign and the administration.
Well, I've already spoken to it. It's the fact that I happened to be in a position traveling with the governor as much as I did to have his ear a little bit, and I was able to recommend any number of really highly qualified individuals for state positions. Boards, commissions, the same. Working in the background in that respect, I guess, is my proudest accomplishment.
Before I ask you for your assessment, I don't want to miss I need to report that as the election night was held, Tom Judge got 195,000 votes. He won by 80,000 votes over Bob Woodall, who had 115,000. It was a 61.7% plurality. It was the largest plurality in the history of Montana to that time. That's why we call this Comeback Kid, because he went from
A year earlier,
Yeah,
it was doubtful
yeah.
when I came on board, and
Your reflection.
not that I had much to do with that, but it was an honor to be a part of it.
This was your first real serious
Well,
thing in politics.
Yeah, I had been involved in the presidential campaign back in 1972 on behalf of George McGovern as a volunteer while a student at the University of Montana, and again in 1974 for Pat Williams when he first ran for Congress. But this had been, the first time it had been something more than an avocation. I was actually part of the
This was you walked in the
governor's
door, which you've been
administration.
in for 40-some years. So any reflections?
Well, I think, like Kent, the people. I think the people mean more than anything. The friendships, the honor of being associated with you and the governor, Lieutenant Governor Schwinden, who went on then in an interesting time to become governor. And the other thing, though, is that I really learned over the course of that time what I talked about at the beginning, that good government is good politics. What the people are paying you to do isn't anything magical. It's not secretive. It isn't behind the scenes, or it's do a good job of governing. Do what they're paying you to do. Govern well. Serve well. And when you do that, you'll be rewarded at the polls.
Well, this is a period of progressive change. All of us had a chance to play a role in it, thanks to Tom Judge. That's part of his story. We'll come back in the next segment and talk about his second administration. And thank you for joining us in the Crucible of Change.